Hello, I hope everybody had a really good weekend, actually, since the last time we were visiting with each other. This week, I was going to talk about gender and art in India, China, and Japan, but two things happened. One, my computer was acting really goofy, so I wasn't able to upload everything I wanted to. But the other was there was so much stuff that I thought it might be better just to focus on Japan this week, and then we can talk about China and India next week. Um, China or Japan is really an interesting country, and there's a lot of really fascinating history there because we see examples of, from our perspective, would be really poor treatment of women, but also we see some amazing examples as well, and women innovators, women inventors, women warriors that were respected. I think that today's treatment of women in Japan is that we see in popular media is something very different than history, but there may be a lot that's echoes as with history as well. And I also wonder, hi Cassidy, I also wonder how much of that is just what we see as observers and how much we layer onto uh, what's actually going on in Japan. One of my favorite artists, Marika Mori, is somebody that I'd like to talk about as well, but I don't think I have anything about her in the module. She is just an excellent example of what or of art being done addressing uh, gender in more contemporary Japan. And there's a lot of other interesting stuff going on. One of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating is that in Japan there is a history of being aware of three genders, which we don't see an awful lot of. There's a history of female samurai. And then there's also, just like if you remember, we talked about Shakespeare, uh, it was illegal for women to be in performing in theater. And so men had to take on the role of women. And we see the same kind of thing going on with Kabuki theater in Japan. So we're going to talk about some visual art, but also we're going to talk about, we're going to extrapolate some, and we're also going to talk about other arts that we can see that were that visual art kind of depicted. I guess with Kabuki, we don't see an awful lot of visual art with that other than masks, but we'll see, or you can see pretty easily, like wood block prints of famous Kabuki plays, which is kind of interesting. So learning a little bit about Kabuki itself can be beneficial. How are you doing, Cassidy? Did you have a good weekend?
I am good, yes. Thanks for asking.
All right, good. Well, of course, we know that Japan is the thing that gives us karate, kaiju, and samurai. Um, and I remember when I was a kid, the kaiju movies were all over after school TV in the late 80s and mid 80s. And it was really cool seeing all these giant monsters. I think one of my favorite was this gigantic turtle that would fly around. His head and legs would go into his shell and they'd be replaced by jet engines. So, that's pretty awesome. I don't know if, have any of you guys seen Kill Bill? Cassidy, have you seen those two movies?
I'm aware of like key moments, but I haven't seen it all the way through. Like the Uma Thurman dance with John Travolta.
Oh, that's from Pulp Fiction. Uma
Oh shoot.
Thurman. Yeah, and
That's
Kill
who's on
Bill.
recording. That's embarrassing.
uh, in Kill Bill, Uma Thurman is like a samurai ninja lady who goes to Japan specifically to get a sword made to kill, Bill, name of the movie. And there's some really amazingly well choreographed fight scenes. But that's something that Japan and China, they've all given us these kind of fight choreography that we can really enjoy in contemporary movies. So that's another contribution to the art world. Just from a surface reading of Japanese culture today, it seems that generally, from just a Western perspective, um, men are really recognized as being working outside of the home in roles like in business and things like that, and women are really recognized as being uh, say the person taking care of the home. And what's interesting about that is that even though there is some reality to that historically, that really doesn't hold up very much with contemporary Japan, even though that's how we think of it. And I just, we're going to go more over the historical arts. And then after we're done, I'll also talk about Mariko Mori and put some of hers in because I think she's fascinating. And then Yayoi Kasumi is another contemporary artist that I think is just amazing. Both of those women. But even though the Emperor of Japan is the result of the longest lasting dynasty that there's evidence of, it's a pretty much unbroken imperial dynasty that goes all the way back to the 4th century AD. Even though that's the case, Japan has seen a lot of changes and differences throughout their history. And I want to talk a little bit about it. I want to look at some images. I think one of the coolest things is the Jomon period. The Jomon period, it's basically Japan, prehistorical Japan. According to mythology, God pulled a spear out of the ocean, and the foam that came off was what formed the Japanese islands. And Japanese history, as you know, Japanese history as a culture of Japan, didn't really get started until halfway through the 4th century AD. And before then, there wasn't much history, but it seemed that there were a lot of artifacts. Nobody seems to know an awful lot about the people that generated the artifacts, but they are there and they look completely different than anything that we recognize as even decades after that culture kind of disappeared, as we don't really see much similarity between the Jomon culture and the Meiji culture, or the culture of what is contemporary, or what is the Japan that grew into the Japan of today. And it's interesting to me because a lot of the times when we think of cultures that have disappeared, that we don't have any historical connection to, we don't really understand, there's no records, they're prehistorical. Usually it seems like that happens through the mists of time. We can't really point to a date like you can with Japan and say in 348 AD is when the Jomon culture ended, or the non-historical culture ended, and Japan, as we understand it, began. You look at the pre-Celts in Northern Europe and Britain, and they seem to have faded out during the Roman occupation. Or we look at Cleopatra's Egypt, it seems to have kind of faded out. And there's it's interesting to me. It just doesn't seem that there is like a really stark date when the prehistorical era stopped and the history began. And I wanted, can you, Cassidy, can you see this, the image that I pulled up with some of these Jomon sculptures?
Yeah, I can see like the dogu, the clay figurines.
Okay, all right, great. The Jomon culture, in their presence or the artifacts that people have found of them in Japan goes all the way back to pretty much the Younger Dryas period, which is right at the tail end of the Ice Age, up until that 300 AD. So it's a huge stretch of time, almost 11,000 years. And what is fascinating to me is to look at these images. Like you get the two dogus on the left here. This one, the first one on the far left, kind of reminds me of a lot of those depictions we've seen of the idealized or divine feminine figure. It kind of reminds me of the Venus of Willendorf. This, I don't know, I kind of like looking at this one. It's so weird. These show up constantly on those ancient alien shows that as proof that the ancient Japanese, before they were Japanese, contacted alien cultures. I don't know. I think it's more of a stylistic thing that identifies this art than any interaction with aliens. But I'm probably too cynical. But we can see on the pottery, we can see echoes of that same kind of coiling and fluting that we see on this doku figure. And the spearhead and the needles, hooks, and harpoon, those really tie very clearly to that end of the Ice Age kind of technology that we expect. But I imagine that they're pretty old. But this jar, both of these clay vessels that you see on this page, they look, they don't feel like they're products of people recovering from the Ice Age. They feel like they're almost contemporary. What do you think, Cassidy? Isn't it kind of interesting that just how this looks?
Yeah, it's extremely unique to me.
Yeah, it's I don't really see it in any other culture, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. Now, these bone hooks and needles and things like that, you do see technology like that around the world, like in Europe. It's very similar to same kind of things in Siberia and Europe that date back to the same time. And this stone spearhead is very similar to things that you see of the same time period in Europe as well. It's almost identical to the napped blades that you find from the Neolithic period. But those, I just think it's absolutely fascinating to see what they produce, the dogu figures and things like that. But there is a very definite change when you go from this to more contemporary Japan. I'm hoping that the copyright will let us include this video, but I want to look at a video really quick that covers some more of the art history. And I also included some more links so that you can see some more Jomon era sculpture, because it's absolutely fascinating. The things that we see that the Jomon culture created look very similar to stuff from a similar time period in the Russian steppes, for example, but also in Central Africa. The thing that's distinctive is the almost Baroque detail on the surface and the distinct distortions of the human form. If these are meant to be human, I'm pretty sure that they are, but I just think that that's absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to
Can I
see
make
if
a
we can
comment
get,
real quick?
yeah.
In my ceramics art history class that the university did, we had a chance to try to make the Dogu figures or try to make some of the pots. And I was so impressed by how difficult these were to make. Like, it really showed how skilled these artists were. And so to see like the Dogus, it could easily be a stylistic option when you see how much they could do with just their vases. If you have that
Hmm.
much skill, it could see that creativity wanting to express it in other ways too.
I think that's a really good observation. And there is a contention among anthropologists that the more detail and the more abstraction put into like sculptural work or work intended to be of technological or practical use, then the wealthier the culture was. The more extra food they had, the more spare time they had. And I think we could probably make, I don't know, that argument seems like it might be consistent with observations we see today. But just the intricacy, I think you're absolutely right. It's absolutely amazing. Well, I know you're right because you have that experience. So I think that's very cool. Were you able to replicate it?
Oh, I was not. Some class members could, but I guess there was some grace given because the Dogu features, like even if you did them kind of incorrectly, you could just say it was stylistic.
Yeah, that's true. I like that because yeah, and you saw from those two figures the one on the far left that looks vaguely feminine, and the one on the right that looks like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters. They're very different, and it would be fascinating to know how far apart they were built. But I think one of the frustrating things is there's so little known about that prehistorical Jomon culture that there's not really a stylistic timeline that I could find, which it doesn't really surprise me because there is so little known. But I thought it was fascinating. So I want to share this short video. It's only about 5 minutes, and if it gets boring, we'll skip through it. But I would like you guys to, even if we don't watch it during this class period, I would like you guys to watch it. But here's somebody with a bit of energy that talks about some of these periods going at the beginning of Japan.
These are videos about Japanese art, and we're going to be covering everything from Shinto shrines to super plot. So let's start off with the very beginning with the Jomon period.
I will say that anybody that speaks all the time with a smile on their face is somebody that you probably shouldn't trust.
The Jomon period, meaning straw rope, lasted from 10,000 BCE to 300 BCE. While the origins of the Jomon period is disputed, they were nomadic hunter-gatherers who later practiced organized farming and built simple houses of wood and thatch set into shallow earthen pits. They're thought to be ancestors of the Ainu people who live in Hokkaido. They're known for these decorated pots which get these patterns by imprinting rope onto wet clay. The earliest pottery were smaller, round-bottom bowls that may have been used for boiling or storing food. They were made from coiled clay and fired on an open fire.
Now, I don't want to watch everything because I want to get a sense for the stylistic things that are going on. But we're dealing with, I know it's in this class, it's a lot more interesting to start looking at the stylized human figures. And that's what we really want to go for. There is a conversation about whether or not art is gendered. And I don't know if anybody could say what gender created these things. But what's fascinating about these Dogu figures is that some of them seem to be free of gender and others seem to have gender. And then, and still others, we can inject gender on top of them from our own presuppositions. Like when we look at this, on the left and the right, which of these two do you think might be masculine, and which of these two do you think might be feminine?
I feel like the one on the left looks more masculine because it almost has like a stance, and it almost looks like the engravings on the arms are like maybe large shoulders and biceps type of thing. And then the one on the right, I don't know, like more curvy and less broad, I guess, per se.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. And on the one on the right, we can kind of see an emphasis of almost breast shapes here that may help to identify this as a feminine form. And you know, we have a little bit of a pointier chin, a more delicate chin. And this definitely, with the arms shaped like this, it looks to me like this figure is communicating something of defiance or battle readiness. But how much of that is what we're injecting onto it or projecting onto it? You know, but I really like what your observations, because these kind of remind me of some of those coiling designs that you see to emphasize like muscular forms, and particularly used in areas where material was very difficult to work, or didn't allow you to get a lot of detail. Like we look at some of the really early European tapestries, you see this kind of curling to emphasize muscles, but also we see that on early like Greek sculpture and Etruscan sculptures too. So it's very interesting. And this, with this kind of detail, the one on the left almost feels like it's armored, and the one on the right almost feels like it's decorative clothing. Do you get the same kind of sense, or do you think I'm just pulling it out of my ear?
No, I agree. I think, yeah, it's hard because we don't want to just be like, oh, this looks like it could be female because of these reasons, but then it could just be genderless, or it could be male rather than female. So I get that too.
Right. Yeah. And I really like the fact that everybody in this class is very aware of the fact that we do a lot of projecting. You know, when we look at art, we project quite a bit. And it's being aware of that, I think, can help us prevent ourselves from declaring something that may or may not be true. And it's something like this, when the sculptures are so old that there's really no way to give them much of a context or to understand the context of their creation. We're pretty much shooting in the dark for the most part. Now, this is pretty fascinating. This kind of vessel is important because it was built on a wheel, a potter's wheel. And there's a couple things that implies. One is that there's a significant amount of technological achievement, but also it implies that there is a safe enough space that somebody could set up a potter's wheel and then produce items with it, which means that the culture that that potter's wheel appears in is not necessarily full-time nomadic. Or if they are nomadic, they're still able to stay rooted in a place long enough that a person could set up a workshop, which would include things like a firing kiln that they would have to use for potentially weeks at a time. So I think that that's absolutely fascinating. Now, these bells are really amazing. We're not going to really talk about them an awful lot, but I want you to be aware of the kind of visual imagery that we see in the different kinds of cultures that we're going to be looking at as we look at some of the stuff in Japan. These stone arrowheads, I think, are amazing. When you see shapes like this is fairly standard. This is relatively, I'm not going to say easy to make, but it's consistent. You can make them consistently. But when you start seeing this with scallops on the side, or when you see going narrow to wide to narrow again, this shows a little, quite a bit of ability to work with the stone. What's really fascinating about Japan too, like every other culture, everybody builds pyramids. But with the Japanese, the ancient Japanese, the pyramids that were built fairly recently. They're about time frame of a lot of the South American and Central American, Mesoamerican pyramids. But what's fascinating to me about them is that it was basically clay and stacked earth, but it was in the shape of these bell-like structures. So you'd have the pyramid here at the base of the bell, and then this was more of a rounded mound right here. And it's entirely unique. It's absolutely fascinating to me. There's something more going on than just the fascination of building a pyramid when you're adding this entire lobe that's the same size as the pyramid itself to one side of it. And then they would also construct these moats to protect them. And like other pyramids elsewhere in the world, it seemed to be very important, either as a structure to hold the dead, or like, these specifically are tombs, or in the case of Central America, there were temples. And in Southeast Asia and other places in Asia, there were also temples. But it's just fascinating to me that these are shaped this way. And here's some armor, some very cool stuff there. And then here we're starting to see some really interesting depictions of human beings. Now, it seems obvious to me the gender of this individual, and it seems to me very obviously a man. And we're past the Jomon culture now. This is about the times that the Vikings started rising. So 6th century AD is what we're looking at. And this is right before Buddhism comes to Japan from Korea. And but this is a very masculine figure. It looks like it's a man with armor. And then we go forward just a little bit, and it shows, what gender do you believe this would be?
Usually highlighting or like defining breasts usually implies female.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And these kind of stacked cone forms make me think of billowed material. This doesn't look like it's a standard kimono style outfit, which I don't think even the kimonos were present in Japan yet, but it does feel to me like this is definitely a woman. This shows one of the mounds that were built, which I think is really fascinating because it looks very much like some of the older Celt stuff. I doubt that these two people communicated with each other very much, but it is fascinating to me that human beings would come up with similar solutions to similar situations. So this is reminiscent of the much earlier burial of Emperor Qin with his terracotta army. I think that's absolutely fascinating. This is a layout of all the burial goods. And then we look at some more cylinders. This is a fascinating figure. And this is identified as a dancing man. And I think, Cassidy, it's because there's not the obvious indicators that would signify it as being feminine. That's not to say they aren't feminine. It just, since they don't have those very obvious indicators, then they are labeled as men. And we have other items. This is another example of a earth mound that that key shape is indicative of the particular Japanese style pyramid. In China, about 1,000 years before this, they started building earth mounds that they were cutting into pyramid shapes. So I get the sense that this is a completed one, and that's not intended to be a pyramid, but I think it's interesting just the same. It seems like sometimes the in a lot of prehistorical cultures, an earthen mound that did not contain weapons seemed to be like a sacred structure meant to be used to commune with the idea of the earth goddess. Like, for example, some of those Venus figurines have been found in earthen mounds shaped very much like that. And that's not just a European thing. That's in a lot of places around the world. Here's some more really groovy stuff. But I just wanted to give a bit of an indication of some of the kinds of art that we can see, or some of the kinds of styles. So Japan started developing an identity for itself about, well, the end of the Jomon culture was about 300. And so Japan started developing its own identity as a culture in that century immediately after the close of the Jomon period. About 300 years later is when Buddhism showed up in Japan. And there's some really fascinating stuff that starts happening there. And during this time period, even though Buddhism is being observed as a religion, do you remember what the religion is, but the indigenous religion of Japan is outside of Buddhism? And it really still really flavors the Japanese Buddhism very distinctly. Do you remember what it's called?
Is it Shinto?
Yes, it's Shinto. And it's a recognition of the divine aspects of the environment. So the kame, or spirits that people would revere, they could be just indicators or of admiration and beauty. Like a particularly gorgeous waterfall would have its own kame. It also recognizes the importance or power of natural events. So a particularly strong storm would have a kame, or an earthquake. It could be ephemeral things like a beautiful tree, or a beautiful flower, or beautiful plants, or even beautiful animals could represent kame. It's more of an awareness, admiration, respect, and sometimes worship of the natural parts of the environment that we either admire as indicators of beauty, or fear. Either one of those, and others too. There's even kame that hover around particularly nasty garbage dumps, that's more of a contemporary thing in a large part, but there's even evidence of that in early Japan. And when the Buddha came, you get this sense of morality that arises outside or beyond martial self-preservation. And what is really fascinating to me is the rise of the Heian period, which happened about 100, 150 years after Buddhism came. The Nara Daibutsu. So Buddhism came about 650 AD, and the imperial capital was Nara, Japan. And at about that time, at the end of the 7th century, the ruling class was so enamored of the Buddha that they built the single largest bronze sculpture in the history of Japan, for the next 1,000 years at least. And it was so massive that's when Japanese started using things like wood and lacquer for coinage instead of before then they made bronze coins. They cast them with a cuttlebone casting technique. But after the Nara Daibutsu, people used a lot of wood carving as well as lacquer sculpting. But talking about the roles of women in Japan at this time, what was really interesting to me is that a peasant woman with absolutely no social standing actually had more social freedom than women that were well-to-do that belonged to the nobility. And I want to look at a website really quick and then watch a short video about this. But the Heian period lasted from the end of the 8th century to the end of the 12th century. So for a good 400 years. And during this period, women, even though they ostensibly were subjugated across the board, it was fascinating to me that the women living in peasant situations had a lot more freedom of movement than women in noble settings or well-to-do settings. And so I'd like you to read this this article about that, and then we also have a video that I want to share. And I think this is kind of funny too. Let's see if I can find it. I hope that we don't lose it due to the YouTube anti-copyright program. So we'll see if we can. But we're not going to watch the whole thing. But what's fascinating about this is we see some of the art out of this period. And it gives you a little bit of a background of what was going on art-wise. So even though the presence of the Buddha and Buddhism really makes it big in Japan at this time, there's still an awful lot going on that doesn't seem consistent with the Buddha's teachings.
Prestige. They wrote from a more woman in the Heian period. It would be extreme boredom, interrupted by casual cheating. Lots and lots of casual cheating. I'll be talking about Heian women and marriage and promiscuity in the next few videos, so click subscribe and the bell to follow along. When I think
this guy goes on, there is a lot of humor to it, but aristocratic women were trained to essentially sit still all day long and look pretty. That was their job. The women themselves became the prestige items for the men who had positions of responsibility. And this produced an awful lot of downtime, a lot of spare time. And so a lot of these women, since they didn't have a lot of avenues to pursue, there was a lot of promiscuity. For example, there was a lot of court intrigue, and the arts came into play because there were a lot of novels that were written by a lot of these women who wrote under male names, but these novels were essentially just long drawn out soap operas about court intrigue and how many people slept with each other. And these women were, I don't see how they could handle the boredom, but from this time period, we get a lot of art that is based on, oh, I'm sorry. That is really frustrating. I'm going to stop sharing that really quick. But we get a lot of artwork that is built around these novels, where the novels are illustrated, as well as there's screens that are painted that show depictions of the scenes from the novels, some of the most famous novels. So you get this really delicate picture of an ideal feminine form that is based on what people did to kind of make these novels come alive. And so I'm going to come. And we also get this picture because women were used essentially as prestige items, we get this very strong idea that women were inferior. Even though they became the masters of court intrigue, they were viewed as inferior by the men. And so, watch through this whole video, and because the guy gives a lot of context. But this also is the time period when black teeth became fashionable, not just for women, but also for young men. And what is fascinating to me too is you start getting this awareness of a third gender that began to emerge, and this comes to the fore later on in art and artwork. But because I'm thinking as an outgrowth of the extreme boredom, you see the women's costumes becoming more and more elaborate, and it was improprietous for a man to look at a woman's face. And so the costumes that they wore were an indication of status and also an indication of beauty, because the man couldn't look at the woman directly. I just think all that kind of stuff is absolutely fascinating. But I have some more some examples of artwork from this period that is really fascinating. So oh no, I'm sorry, I'm not finding it. I mentioned that I was having a hard time with my computer today, and it seems to have dropped some of the things that I had saved to show everybody. If you look over the art of the Heian period at the Met, it only gives a couple examples of artwork, and then but I also wanted to show. I'm gonna pull up my search page where you see a lot more stuff, and you can see something of a consistency of the delicacy of the renderings from this period. Lot of painting. Some of this was in scrolls that were these torrid novels that were meant to entertain. And some of them were screens that were used to kind of, in a roundabout way, emphasize the promiscuity or the willingness to promiscuity of the women involved or depicted. And as we go through, we can see some really fascinating stuff that was being produced during the Heian period until about the 12th century. 12th century, I think, also brings in the era of Christian missionaries, which is interesting. We see these depictions of people in everyday life on a very plain background. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not communicating the images that I pulled up. Can you, Cassidy, can you see my screen at all? I know that these are really small, but a lot of these images, they depict these women with that more traditional clothing style that we're familiar with Japanese culture. And you can see the elaborate hairstyles, the very white painted faces. These are things that grew out of that Heian period, coming a little bit more contemporary. So I'm going to stop sharing that. One thing that I found absolutely fascinating is the gender roles, how genders were viewed in Japan. Looking at what the Heians did and looking at this kind of stuff, the art seems to show that women stayed still, and they had to be looked at as dolls pretty much, and the men were the ones going out and doing everything, and it seems very bipolar. However, one of the things that really fascinates me is the growth or the development of a third, essentially a third gender in Japanese culture. And I want to share this video with you really quick. It's only about 4 minutes long, but it talks about that. Let's see if I can pull it up here. As we watch the videos, Cassidy, can you hear the volume?
So far, I've been able to.
Okay, excellent. All right.
Medieval Japan. Women in medieval Japan could be considered as being much less fortunate than the women of today's Japan. However, even though men were valued by Japan more than women, they still played a very important role in the society of medieval Japan. Japanese women were mothers, entertainers, and sometimes...
As you listen to this and hear the person talking about it, this is from a Japanese historical perspective. Pay attention to how much narrative the author of this video is putting into the work that is created too.
Even warriors. Considered as the backbone of the family, often the women were relied on for their homeopathic medicines, their housewife knowledge of cooking, cleaning, and understanding of children, and even fighting alongside their husbands. The amount of freedom a woman received in medieval Japan was hugely based off her social class, but not the way that you'd expect. Women of low class typically had to care for children and do all of the housework, not just for themselves, but also for the other wealthier families too. These low-class women actually had a lot of freedom. Generally, the rule was that as a young girl, a woman would obey her father, followed by her husband when she married, and if she was to widow, her son if she had one. However, the women would often be seen farming alongside the men, and the money that they would earn from this could be spent on whatever the woman wanted, paying taxes, buying clothes for her children, or groceries. When it came to marriage, women of low class had a say in who they wanted to marry. As you would expect, women of high class lived much stricter lives due to their wealth and reputation, but strangely, and very unfortunately, they had the littlest freedom in the whole of Japan. Marriage was very important in this time, as it was seen as an alliance between families and a way to keep the clan and family name strong. Women didn't usually get a choice in groom, however, as families would tend to choose a man for the woman who would increase their affluence and wealth of the family, and thus the woman was expected to appreciate this gesture. Unlike low-class women, they could not escape marriage at all. Well, they could, by becoming a nun or a monk of Buddhism and renouncing your social position alongside with all your money too. Oh, and not to mention that you would have a reputation as a deceitful, treacherous, and amoral woman. What about the other women in society? There were geishas too. However, this name is often misconstrued and misunderstood. The term geisha is often used to describe a man's glorified mistress, or to put it bluntly, a whore. This is incorrect, however. Geishas were actually one of the most respected groups of women in the whole of the Japanese society. Before a woman becomes a geisha, they are referred to as maikoa, who learned how to converse with men, carry out traditional tea ceremonies and dances to perfection, and also play stringed instruments to serenade audiences and families. When maturing into a young woman and becoming a geisha, they were often used to spy, infiltrate, and assassinate. The geishas had a huge advantage, as because they were so highly respected, the target would be completely defenseless against her. The only way he could prevent himself from being killed would be to have her killed by someone else before she could kill him. Similarly, in terms of fighting, samurai women were trained to fight just as male samurais were. They did sometimes fight in battle alongside their husbands or brothers, but this was quite rare. The perfect samurai woman would still be submissive to a man, yet also docile, humble, intelligent, and quick-witted. It may be considered odd that women who were trained to fight would rarely actually be seen in battle, but the purpose of this was so that they could defend their homes and children in times of desperate need. So, in conclusion, even though some women were given the same training as men, they were still considered to be weaker and feebler than the males, a gender role and misconception that was not broken for a very long time. However, we could also view this as men were never the ones who stayed home and did the cooking and the cleaning, which equally is still believed to be true to some extent even nowadays.
what is interesting to me about the role of Japanese women historically is that even though the men viewed them as inferior and weak, it was fascinating to me because looking back, they still did an awful lot with, still trying to fit into that subset. And there's a really beautiful woodblock print that I found that shows a woman samurai with her male samurai husband defending a castle. And this is something that we don't really talk about at all. It's something that, but the women were trained as warriors alongside men, especially in the samurai class. And there was even a name given to them. The name was, I'm sorry, I thought I was showing this, duh. I thought I was showing this image. Sorry about that. So this is an image that the person on horseback is the male. The person standing on the ground, this is a woman, his wife. And the name for a male or a female samurai was Onna-Bugeisha. And there are depictions of several famous ones in Japanese art as well. This is one, but you can find a whole lot of different ones. They were subject of a lot of the woodblock prints that were really very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. I wanted to show briefly from the Honolulu Museum of Art how the concepts of gender kind of were illustrated and communicated. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to share this tab. This it comes from a podcast called Shunga, where they talk about the three different genders. And this is only a minute and a half long, but it was really eye-opening.
The misunderstanding that Shunga has helped to clarify is whether the figures depicted in an artwork are men or women. Surprisingly, the answer is often neither. Many scholars now propose the existence of a third gender during early modern and pre-modern Japan. Biologically male individuals whose appearance, use of language, and mannerisms were neither masculine nor feminine, and who had sexual relations with both men and women. Art historical texts often describe these individuals as young men or dandies.
Now, what is fascinating about this is in artwork like this and in woodblock prints, so screen paintings and woodblock prints, there were specific indicators that the artist would use to show whether this the individual being depicted was an Onna-Bugeisha or a female samurai, or if they were a member of this third gender. And this this short little thing talks about that a bit.
But in this exhibition, they are described simply as wakashu, categorically distinct from both women, Onna, and older biological males, Yaro. Wakashu can be identified most easily by their hairstyles. While Yaro shaved the tops of their heads completely, wakashu shaved only the back half of their.
I think another indicator of this that I think is really interesting is that when you see portraits of wakashu, there is something going on with the nose and the chin and the cheekbones where it looks a little bit more feminine than a typical depiction of a young man. So as you do your own research and look at this kind of stuff, artwork from, we're talking about probably 1600s up until the 1900s, when you see these kinds of odd hairstyles that don't really seem very masculine or feminine, and you see this vaguely feminine cast to the face, then it's most likely that this is going to be a depiction of a wakashu.
Their heads, and their forelocks remained intact. Sometimes wakashu covered the tops of their heads with brightly colored brimless caps. Another signifier of wakashu was their long-sleeved kimonos. While the idea of a third gender may sound like an obscure oddity of early modern Japanese culture, wakashu were in fact extremely popular and played active roles in Japanese society, particularly in samurai communities, Buddhist temples, and Kabuki theater. Images of wakashu can be found throughout this exhibition, as well as in other Japanese artworks this museum regularly shows. See how many you can find. The frequency of their appearance may surprise you.
It's absolutely amazing to me. As soon as I started realizing the wakashu were a real thing, they started popping up everywhere, or at least visually, I started recognizing them everywhere, and I thought that was amazing. And we do really see them. But I wanted to. One of the reasons why they show up around Kabuki was because of the Buddhist and Confucian influence on Kabuki theater. And I am kind of bouncing around a couple things. My brain is like a pachinko machine, but I wanted to get to that in just a little bit. Let's go back and look at a little bit of the female samurai warriors. Let's see. The female samurai warriors were called the Onna-Bugeisha. And what is really amazing to me too is that there is quite a bit of art that we can see that shows the Onna-Bugeisha. And it's something that I didn't realize was present until I started knowing what to look for. Because of course I come into this thinking that all Japanese women were subjugated and just stayed home all the time, without even realizing that the Onna-Bugeisha were actually a necessary part of the samurai warfare. They would fight alongside their husbands, and they would fight as battling sisterhoods, kind of like the sisterhoods of Isis worshippers in the later Roman later Roman periods.
At the most recent Met Gala, Rihanna appeared in a Comme des Garçons dress inspired by Onna-Bugeisha, also known as women samurai. Bright florals adorning samurai armor silhouettes conjured images of these Japanese warriors of ages past. Like male samurai, Onna-Bugeisha.
Okay, as we look at this, there are, in this short video, there are actual images of real Onna-Bugeisha, and they knew how to fight with a sword just as effectively as the male samurai did. And they wore the same kind of armor. The biggest difference was sometimes that they would have brighter floral designs on their clothing, on their costumes, but not always. Sometimes the male samurai had really brightly colored stuff to kind of essentially thumb their nose at the enemies, because every samurai knew that once you made your name, people were going to be coming after you, and so the more not hoity-toity, that's not the right word. The more prideful of the male samurai would sometimes have more colorful outfits to kind of thumb their nose at the people that were gunning for them, essentially, and so it wasn't always that the Onna-Bugeisha had the brighter colored outfits, but sometimes they did.
Geisha were noble individuals, highly educated in science, math, and literature, who fought alongside their husbands, fathers, and fellow women warriors to defend their home and country's honor. One legendary Onna-Bugeisha, Empress Jingu, ruled Japan for 68 years and led armies in conquest. Remembered for her radical transcendence of social economic structures in 200 AD, she was the first woman to be featured on Japanese currency. Another fearless precursor, Tomoe Gozen, was a general's concubine turned Onna-Bugeisha, who fought in the Genpei War. She was documented to be ungodly beautiful, but remarkably skilled as a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god. 600 years later, Takano Takeko led an underground women's army in Japan's Boshin Civil War. After being shot in the chest by the enemy, Takeko asked to have her head cut off and buried in honor rather than to be captured as a war trophy. Although they are less celebrated than their male counterparts, Onna-Bugeisha played an important role in Japan's history and continue to inspire generations to come.
Okay, and this gives us a little bit of background, but you could also see in here one of the things that I liked is that there's a lot of references to again screen paintings and other paintings showing the Onna-Bugeisha. It seems like the characterizations of them were that, or the depictions of them showed that more feminine face within the masculine samurai armor. And we don't see indicators of the breasts like we did with the Jomon sculptures. But it seems to me that, you get this tiny mouth, that the tiny red mouth was an indicator of feminine beauty. And I think that the curve of the face, there's less pronounced cheek and jawbones. So it's a little bit smoother. But what is a little bit frustrating is that a lot of artists who depicted samurai without their masks still showed many of the male samurai with that same kind of chin and cheek structure. But we can still see some of it present in the art. And I think, some of these old images. Now she said 200 AD. I don't think that's accurate, because that was still the height of the Jomon culture. So I think it's a little bit more recent than that. Most of this sword style, most of this fighting style, most of these kinds of things weren't really super prevalent until the height of medieval Japan, which was towards the Heian culture and forward, or the Heian era and more recent than that. Now, a really good selection of Japanese art comes from the ukiyo-e, which is woodblock prints. As you look at these, I'm not going to turn the sound on. I'm going to leave the sound off. But as you look at these, think in your mind about what you've seen of European impressionists, because these woodblock prints, they were printed on really thin paper that was really common, and they were used to basically decorate bare walls. And so they were used as wallpaper, but they were so common and so cheap that they were used as packing material when trade goods were sent to Europe. And so you get a lot of the impressionists working in Europe. They would come across, basically this was cheap wrapping paper, and it really influenced their work. Particularly, we can really see that in Cezanne and Van Gogh. But the reason I want to show this is because some of these images that we can see kind of reflects that perspective of the male-female dynamic. I'm thinking, I want to pull this a little bit. The way that these characters are standing and the way that the faces are made, I think this figure might be a wakashu. But I'm not certain, but it seems to be consistent with the other markers that we've seen. And this would be appropriate because it comes from the right time period. What do you think, Cassidy? Do you kind of see that same kind of thing? This figure doesn't have the breast markers, and the face seems rather feminine, but the hairstyle seems a little bit more masculine. And this could also be an Onna-Bugeisha because of the sword there too. Or it could just be a young flamboyant samurai. So that's a little bit frustrating. These are very obviously women. I say very obviously. I think that there's a really good chance they might be women. But at this time period also, flowers were very common on male kimonos as well. So that's a little bit frustrating. Here, both the figures on the left are women. And on the right, see the person holding the umbrella has visual markers for a male. And in Europe at the time period, somebody holding a little boat would most likely be an indicator for a boy. And again, these are all woodblock prints. And one of the most famous woodblock print artists, it's suspected that his daughter was actually doing a lot of his work because he had become a drunk later on in his career. So these appear to be geishas. But what's a little bit frustrating too is this, I can't read this, but this seems to be a little bit pointier, a little bit more defined jaw and cheekbone. This could be a male kabuki player, except we don't have the face paint or anything like that. So we're looking at women here. This is pretty much a man, and I think this is most likely a woman. Hiroshige was one of the most amazing woodblock artists. He did a lot of just incredible stuff, and then and there were several, and it's kind of a shock to me that their work would be used as wrapping paper because people gave it such little notice. Here we have two male samurai. And then we start getting into photography too, as reference points for some of the figural work in the ukiyo-e depictions. But we're getting, I think at the beginning of this, we started closer to about end of the 18th century. And here we start getting into pretty much the middle of the 19th century. And you see some of that Victorian era dress coming into the Japanese clothing aesthetic. And there's a really good chance that this is a woman. She has a lot, she wears the female indicators from Western costume. Rather martial scene. And here we see a depiction of like a family compound. And it looks to me, I don't see any wakashu here. I do see there's a male here, and it looks like most of these are females, or yeah, it looks like they're all female adults, with the possibility that this might be a young lady. And then at the end of this video, it's kind of cool because there's a demonstration about how they made these woodblock prints. But what's really neat is this person also shows how they influenced those impressionist artists in Europe. And you can see some of the echoes of that. But I think it's particularly obvious that of the influence on Van Gogh. And I also wanted to share something that I think is just really interesting. If we're looking at gender in Japanese art, one thing that we cannot ignore at all is theater. Even though the geisha were respected women performers, theater seems to be something that is treated harshly across several cultures. And part of that shows up in the prohibitions against typical gender roles that are portrayed in the plays being enacted during the theater. And so I'm gonna show this. This just gives a really short history of Kabuki, and we're almost done here.
Many elements of traditional Japanese culture, such as cuisine and martial arts, are well known throughout the world. Kabuki, a form of classical theater performance, may not be as well understood in the West, but has evolved over 400 years to still maintain influence and popularity to this day. The word kabuki is derived from the Japanese verb kabuku, meaning out of the ordinary or bizarre. Its history began in early 17th century Kyoto.
The idea of kabuki meaning bizarre, there's a lot of surrealism that takes place in the kabuki theater. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that echoes of this sensibility have appeared throughout the performing arts that you see in Japan. So we're talking bunraku, the puppet theater, as well as traditional Japanese cinema, particularly like, and then later on in fantasy and science fiction Japanese cinema, and even into anime. There's still a lot of atmosphere of the kabuki, or the absurd or the surreal. In Western plays, Western theatrical performances, we are really comfortable with the very strong Greek idea that the story needs to be tied together. That's what we're looking for. That every movie that you're going to watch is produced by an American production company with an American director is going to have a story that is going to lend itself towards beginning, a middle, and a resolution where everything is tied together. We expect the storyline to be consistent and flow. Even if we don't understand it at the beginning, by the end, we should be able to understand it. And that all comes from early Greek theater and the rules of Greek theater that were established or recorded by, I think it was Aristotle. But with kabuki being based in this kind of surreal, unreal storytelling context, when you look at, for example, science fiction and fantasy theater and film from Japan even today, and especially anime, storylines do not need to be consistent. Storylines do not need to resolve themselves. You don't have to finalize things. You don't have to have everything resolved, and the audience doesn't really expect it. And so it can be really unnerving if you're going as an American, if you're going to watch kabuki or bunraku or Japanese fantasy cinema, it can be really unnerving. Just as an example, horror cinema is really good for this. In a lot of Japanese horror cinema is based on Japanese folk tales about ghosts that are vengeful, where there is no resolution. But for American horror, the audience really needs and hungers for resolution in the ghost telling. So that's the ghost story. So that's just something that I think is really kind of interesting.
Kyoto, where a shrine maiden named Izumo no Okuni would use the city's dry Kamo riverbed as a stage to perform unusual dances for passerby, who found her daring parodies of Buddhist prayers both entertaining and mesmerizing. Soon other troupes began performing in the same style, and kabuki made history as Japan's first dramatic performance form catering to the common people. By relying on makeup, or kesho, and facial expressions instead of masks, and focusing on historical events and everyday life rather than folk tales, kabuki set itself apart from the upper-class dance theater form known as no.
I was also going to mention really quick that part of kabuki training, in some schools of kabuki, people are trained to keep their eyes crossed for hours at a time while they perform. Their eyes don't remain crossed all the time, but they have that much control over their facial features, which I think is pretty incredible too.
and provided a unique commentary on society during the Edo period. At first, the dance was practiced only by females and commonly referred to as Onna-Bugeisha. It soon evolved to an ensemble performance and became a regular attraction at tea houses, drawing audiences from all social classes. At this point, Onna-Bugeisha was often risque, as geishas performed not only to show off their singing and dancing abilities, but also to advertise their bodies to potential clients. A ban by the conservative Tokugawa shogunate in 1629 led to the emergence of wakashu kabuki, with young boys as actors. But when this was also banned for...
Okay, do you recognize, Cassidy, do you recognize that term? Oh, I'm sorry. We're almost up to time. Wakashu is that third gender that we spoke about briefly. So kabuki began as a women-only performance, turned into something as a cabaret, and when the shogunate got their hand on it and started cracking down on these kind of risque performances, then you get the third gender involved, the wakashu.
In 1629, led to the emergence of wakashu kabuki, with young boys as actors. But when this was also banned, for similar reasons, there was a transition to yaro kabuki, performed by men, necessitating elaborate costumes and makeup for those.
So the third genre kind of filled in the gap between the all-women performers and this all-men performance. And it's fascinating to me that very male, people with all the male masculine markers that we normally expect in a society would have become world-renowned kabuki performers whose job is to play the roles of females in the plays. And I just think that that's absolutely fascinating. So when they're off the stage, they form the they act as very stereotypical males in Japanese society, very masculine males. And then as soon as they get dressed up for the kabuki stage, they transform into women in that imaginative realm of kabuki theater.
Playing female roles, or onagata. Attempts by the government to control kabuki didn't end with bans on the gender or age of performers. The Tokugawa military group, or bakufu, was fueled by Confucian ideals and often enacted sanctions on costume fabrics, stage weaponry, and the subject matter of the plot. At the same time, kabuki became closely associated with and influenced by bunraku, an elaborate form of puppet theater. Due to these influences, the once spontaneous one-act dance evolved into a structured 5-act play, often based on the tenets of Confucian philosophy. Before 1868, when the Tokugawa shogunate fell and Emperor Meiji was restored to power, Japan had practiced isolation from other countries, or sakoku, and thus the development of kabuki had mostly been shaped by domestic influences. But even before this period, European artists, such as Claude Monet, had become interested in and inspired by Japanese art, such as woodblock prints, as well as live performance. After 1868, others, such as Vincent van Gogh and composer Claude Debussy, began to incorporate kabuki influences in their work, while kabuki itself underwent much change and experimentation to adapt to the new modern era. Like other traditional art forms, kabuki suffered in popularity in the wake of World War II, but innovation by artists such as director Tetsuji Takechi led to a resurgence shortly after. Indeed, kabuki was even considered a popular form of entertainment amongst American troops stationed in Japan, despite initial US censorship of Japanese traditions. Today, kabuki still lives on as an integral part of Japan's rich cultural heritage, extending its influence beyond the stage to television, film, and anime. The art form pioneered by Okuni continues to delight audiences with the actors' elaborate makeup, extravagant and delicately embroidered costumes, and the unmistakable melodrama of the stories told on stage.
for this module, I'm going to also put in something that gives you segments of Kabuki plays. And if you wanted to use that as one of your art pieces to examine and apply the 4 tools of artistic critique to, that'd be completely fine. Because we can see that Kabuki, even the costumes and designs of the masks that are created specifically to tell us about the character and gender of the actors involved, or actually the characters being portrayed. We can see that echoed in Japanese anime, as well as even cinema produced in America and in the US and Europe that plays on the same kind of ideas and melodrama of Kabuki. And I think it's really kind of cool. There's a hint in that video we just looked at pointing to Matrix, which the Keanu Reeves Matrix, those movies are, we could also argue that that's a form of Kabuki theater, which I think is pretty awesome. Anyway, there's an awful lot of stuff to go through, and I'm sorry I am a little bit discombobulated because my technology was not working the way I had hoped, but I hope you got something out of this. I really love that whole exploration of wakashu and the Onna-Bugeisha. I think stuff like, when we find stuff like that about other cultures, it's absolutely astounding and it's amazing. So again, I will put up a link for some Kabuki theater too that you guys can look at if you'd like, and do your own research. Find something that maybe contains some of that wakashu and Onna-Bugeisha imagery as well. I think that'd be absolutely fascinating. Well, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful weekend, and I look forward to talking to you next week as well. And everybody be safe and enjoy the rest of your week.